We started last week Matthew chapters 24 and 25, and if you've been following along with us in Matthew's gospel account, Matthew, how he structures his gospel is he alternates between a big chunk of narrative and then a big chunk of teaching. Well, we are in what is considered the last big chunk of teaching in Matthew's gospel account, and how this is commonly phrased is it's these great discourses is what scholars and commentaries refer to them as, these great discourses that Matthew has from, of course, Jesus. It's big teachings of Jesus. And this is the last one, Matthew chapters 24 and 25. You could clump chapter 23 in that as well, but they're not really related, so I tend to not do that. They're somewhat related, but where I tend to start it from is in chapter 24, because this is where Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, and so the setting kind of shifts from chapter 23 to 24. And this is why this is commonly referred to, as you can see on the screen, as the Olivet Discourse, because Jesus is saying these things while he's on the Mount of Olives. And so the general theme, and this is all stuff we went over last week, but I'm just reviewing a little bit. The general theme of this discourse, chapter 24 and 25, is that of judgment to come. And you can kind of break it in different sections. One section is actually the context leading up to this teaching. When you look at Jesus' time in Jerusalem, ever since he entered Jerusalem in chapter 21, he has spoken pretty strongly against the Jewish leaders there. So this has been a lot of indictments, and the climax of that is in chapter 23, the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees, or 8, depending on what translation you have. Some manuscripts have an extra one, or maybe some manuscripts take one out, depending on how you look at it, I guess. But Jesus has been speaking strongly against the Jewish leaders. This is serving sort of as an indictment, and so they are deserving of judgment that is to come. And then the first part of this discourse, the bulk of chapter 24, what we see happening here is Jesus seems, to me at least, you may disagree, but he seems to simultaneously be speaking of two coming judgments. And those two coming judgments would be the destruction of the temple, which, as Jesus was saying these words, hadn't happened yet. And as Matthew was writing his gospel account, probably hadn't happened yet. Some scholars say it was written after 70 A.D., but that doesn't seem likely in my estimation, which I'm not an expert by any means. But so the destruction of the temple is one, and the other one would be the end of the age, which Jesus talks about here. And so kind of what prompts this discussion, Jesus' disciples come and they tell Jesus some things about the temple. And Jesus, in verse 2 of this chapter of Matthew 24, tells them, more or less, that this temple is going to be destroyed. And then in verse 3, the disciples come and they say, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So Jesus has sort of piqued their interest, so to speak. And of course he has, because he's talked about the destruction of an institution that they valued pretty highly, being the temple. And so they asked Jesus this question, but really, when you dive into this, you can see that they're actually asking about three things. First, they say, "When will these things be?" That's pertaining to the destruction of the temple. "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So here you have three particular topics that are brought up: the destruction of the temple, the second coming of Jesus, and the end of the age. And we spent a lot of time last week kind of unpacking the idea behind this, how you have here three ideas brought up: destruction of the temple, second coming of Jesus, the end of the age. And the conclusion, at least that I come to, and again, you may disagree, and if you do, that's fine, but there's one event which, in our context today, in the year 2025, has already happened. That event being the destruction of the temple that happened in 70 A.D. There's a lot of secular history that tells us about that. In particular, Josephus gives some pretty good history about that. Josephus being a Jewish historian. But then you have the idea of the second coming of Jesus and the end of the age. And when you look at the Bible as a whole and how the Bible portrays these events as happening, the conclusion, at least that I come to, is that these also, although described in two different things, the second coming of Jesus and the end of the age, these things are also one event which is happening later, which we are still waiting for to this day. And so what you have happening here, Jesus, the disciples ask him about three particular things. Really, it's two events: the destruction of the temple and then the return of Jesus and the subsequent end of the age. Because when Jesus comes back, there's really nothing else that's coming, right? There's nothing else worth waiting for. And so what you see happening here in Jesus' answer, he gives one answer, and it's hard to dissect what particular thing Jesus is talking about in each particular instance. And so what it seems to happen, he's sort of ambiguous in his answer. And there are some cases where you can more or less figure out what he's talking about, but other times it's hard to tell. And so what seems to really be happening here is Jesus, he's giving one answer with a sort of double fulfillment. He gives an answer, and it could be true of the temple, but it could also be true of his coming and the end of the age. And so we unpacked all of this last week. I'm just bringing it up again for the sake of context, because it matters as we go through the rest of this chapter. And we won't finish all of 24 today, but we'll get through a pretty big chunk of it. We looked in a little bit of detail, not a lot of detail, but a little bit in the first 14 verses about these signs that Jesus brings up. They ask him about when these things will be, and Jesus begins to answer it. So in verse 5, he talks about many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they'll lead many astray. So he talks about false Christs. In verse 6, he talks about wars. Kingdoms will be against kingdoms in verse 7. Also in verse 7, there will be famines and earthquakes. Verse 9, there's talk of tribulation and talk of killing, people being put to death. In verse 10, there's talk of falling away. People will fall away. There's talk of betrayal. In verse 11, there's mention of false prophets. Verse 12, there's going to be an increase of lawlessness. And then in verse 14, the gospel will be proclaimed throughout the world. And the conclusion that we reached last week, and this was kind of the end of the class, these things are already happening. We can see these things happening in our world and in our context today. There's been false Christs that have come, people saying, I'm the Christ. You can look at history and you can see that to be the case. Wars are happening even today, even this very second, in different parts of the world. Kingdoms go up against kingdoms. That kind of goes along with wars. Famines and earthquakes. This has been true for really all of human history. Tribulation and killings. We've got brethren across the world that suffer from tribulation and killings. Falling away and betrayal. We know people, unfortunately, who have fallen away from the church. False prophets. Jesus warned of false prophets even then in the Sermon on the Mount. He talked about you'll know them by their fruit. They come in as sheep, but they're ravenous wolves, the wolves in sheep's clothing image. Jesus brings that up, and he's talking about false prophets when he does that. Increase of lawlessness. That's perhaps a little relative, but it seems that you could make that case today. And then the gospel being proclaimed throughout the world. It's what happens in the book of Acts. Acts 1 and verse 8, kind of the summary verse of the entire book. Jesus says, you'll be my witnesses, speaking to his disciples in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. How does the book of Acts end? Paul is in Rome. He's taken the gospel to, as they thought of it at that time, the ends of the earth. And so we came with an understanding last week of realizing that we are in the last days. And there's other verses you can go to that supplement this idea, such as Hebrews 1, where the writer says that in these last days God has spoken to us through his Son. Or you could look at in 2 Timothy, in the last days people will fall away and so on and so forth. And we looked at all of that last week. John and 1 John 2, we know we're in the last days because antichrists have come. An antichrist is someone who's simply antichrist. That's what that means. It's not some sort of demonic force or anything like that, like what Hollywood might make you think. And so we've unpacked all of this last week, and now we're going to continue looking through some of the rest of this chapter as much as I have time for this morning. And let's start by reading, starting in verse 15, where Jesus warns of this abomination of desolation. That sounds kind of scary, doesn't it? Starting in verse 15, let's see, how far should I go? I'll read through verse 28, I guess. It says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." So that's a lot. That seems kind of weird to read. And so let's unpack this a little bit. Well, Jesus warns first of this abomination of desolation. That's what we read in verse 15. And what he's referring to, and it's interesting, he actually names where he gets this from. He gets it from the prophet Daniel. And in particular, there's 3 references to this in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 9, in Daniel chapter 11, and also in Daniel chapter 12, the last chapter. And I think verse 11 is the second to last verse of the entire book of Daniel. Daniel, if you've studied it, is a little odd. Or perhaps you remember from when me and Jim preached through it a few years ago. The first half of it is the stuff that we're mostly familiar with, the story of Daniel and the diet that he goes on in chapter 1. They eat just the vegetables. You have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. You have the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That's stuff we learn when we're young. We're pretty familiar with all of that. But then you get into chapter 7, and the tone of the book sort of changes. And it changes in particular from a more narrative-based account to a more prophetic and even apocalyptic-based sort of account. The second half of Daniel is apocalyptic by nature, similar to the book of Revelation. Revelation is also apocalyptic literature, which is a particular type of Jewish literature. And you can kind of see some of the tones of that in what Jesus is talking about here in this discussion. And he references this that we read from Daniel in 3 places. And in particular, there's parallels with Daniel 12 in some of the things that Jesus talks about. And as we see, Jesus refers to the holy place. That is referring to the temple. So it might seem as if he's specifically talking about the temple here, but the things he says also applies to his coming and the end of the age. You can see the double fulfillment here taking shape. Kaufman refers to this even as typology, as if to say the destruction of the temple is a type, and it's referring to Jesus' return, which perhaps you can make that case. I don't know if I would, but... So this raises the question. He's referred to this abomination of desolation. Well, what is that? What this is referring to, if you unpack the words literally, it's an abomination that leads to desolation. That's the idea that we see here. Something abominable, something that is detestable, because that's what the word abomination means, something that the Lord feels very strongly against, which leads to this sort of desolation. So what is this? Well, depending on the context, it might refer to different things. And that's perfectly fine, because you see a lot of that in the Bible, this double fulfillment type thing. So if you're reading this in Daniel's context, as Daniel is referring to this is what most scholars believe, if you study it in Daniel's context, that this is perhaps referring to what in Daniel's context would have been the forthcoming actions of Antiochus Epiphanes. And you may not be familiar with this because it's not in our Bibles, but it is this sort of thing is talked about in the books of Maccabees, and this is this is historical things. You can look at other sources of history, but the book of Maccabees happens to be an instance of that. Antiochus Epiphanes, I believe he was a ruler of the Seleucid Empire. I think that's right. And unless I'm getting my empires mixed up, there's a lot of coming and going of empires in the intertestamental period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And Antiochus Epiphanes was a brutal ruler who severely persecuted the Jews. And what he did in particular, among other things, but this is perhaps the most egregious thing that he did, and all of this happened in about the 2nd century BC, about the 160s BC, sometime in there, if I recall correctly. What he did, he took over the Jewish temple, which, keep in mind, at this point had been rebuilt. This happened in the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and all of that. And what he did, he took over the temple, he turned it into a temple for Zeus, the Greek god, and he offered a swine on the altar. This would have been really detestable to the Jews, because not only is he making an offering to another god, but he's making an offering that was ceremonially unclean. He puts a swine on the altar of God. Well, to the Jews, this is a very detestable thing, and this leads to, and it was kind of already happening, but the Maccabean revolt happens, and so on and so forth, and that's all history that you can read about. So in Daniel's context, some say this is what he's referring to, the abomination of desolation. The abomination being what Antiochus Epiphanes does in offering that swine on the altar to Zeus, which leads to some sort of desolation. Well, in Christ's context, this is very strongly alluding, of course, to the forthcoming destruction of the temple. And again, if you unpack this literally, you have an abomination, which is, in their context, the unfaithfulness of the Jewish leaders, leading to desolation, which is going to eventually be the destruction of the temple. And you can even see that desolation taking shape when Jesus leaves the temple. And what Jesus goes on to say after leaving the temple in chapter 37 and verse 38, where he says, "See, your house is left to you desolate." So Jesus leaving the temple makes the temple then desolate. And if it's desolate, God isn't going to protect it any longer. And then Rome comes and they destroy it in 70 A.D. So that's perhaps a historical thing that Jesus is pointing to, but then you have what could perhaps be an eschatological context, and this refers to things that happen in the end. That's what eschatology is, the study of the end, right? The end of the age. That comes from the Greek word eschaton. And what you have here is a possible allusion to the end of the age and the final judgment. Well, what you have happening here is you have an abomination, which you could perhaps broadly think of as sin in general, leading to desolation, where we are desolate from God. Our sin separates us from God, which is spiritual death, separation from God. And so that abomination leads to that desolation. You can kind of put the pieces together and make that case. So Jesus brings up this abomination of desolation. And in particular, he has a warning about it. When you see it happening, he tells them to do something. What he tells them to do is to flee, run away. Specifically, he says in verse 16, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And from what I understand, this phrase that he uses, it's a semantic kind of thing, and it literally means to go to where the caves are. You go to the mountain and you hide in the caves. That's the idea behind what Jesus is getting at here, where the caves are. And you can see the sense of urgency as Jesus is telling them this, where he says in verse 17, "Let the one who's on the housetop not go down to take what's in his house." Sort of like when you have a fire in your house in the middle of the night. It's so urgent, you're not going to try to grab all your stuff. You need to just simply get out of there as quickly as you can. This is a similar circumstance. When you see this happening, drop what you're doing and leave, and don't try to take anything with you. Don't take the time to get the things from your house. And he says in verse 18, "Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak." Don't even go back and get your cloak. It's worth freezing if you have to leave, if you're going to end up being destroyed if you stay back. And so this again highlights the urgency behind what Jesus is conveying here. And if you study the history of the destruction of the temple, it was pretty brutal. They left it They didn't leave anything behind. It was a total destruction. So when you look at fleeing in, again, these certain contexts, what could this mean? Well, in Judea, this is the context that Jesus specifically names. If you're in Judea, do this. This is referring to fleeing the destruction of the temple. Because they not only destroy the temple, but they destroy the city of Jerusalem as well, more or less. And so this refers to running away and trying to find a safe place, which secular history tells us that a lot of the Christians were able to get out of Jerusalem in time, perhaps because of this warning that Jesus gave. But in eschatology, in the study of the end, perhaps this is referring to trying to flee from the wrath of God, which of course we know that you can't run from. All of us are deserving of it, but if we're covered in the blood of Jesus, we won't receive the wrath of God, but those who aren't covered will receive it, and it's not escapable. The only way to escape it is to be covered in the blood of Jesus. This reminds me, we're going to make a few connections to the book of Revelation. As I was studying this, it reminded me of a lot of things that we read in the Revelation. And because of the nature of the literature, they're both sort of apocalyptic in nature, you can perhaps make some of these cases while being honest. This reminds me a lot in Revelation 6, speaking of fleeing and going to the mountains. This is, if I recall correctly, the 7 seals are being broken, and this is after, I think, the 6th seal is broken in Revelation 6. And it says, this is starting in verse 15, "The kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who's seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath is come, and who can stand?'" So here we see, and this is the connection I'm making here, they go and they hide themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And think about how severe this is, to where they would rather be crushed by the mountains than face the wrath of God. What they don't realize is, even if the mountains crush them, they will still face God's wrath. In the context of Revelation, I really like this chapter, because they ask the question at the end, who can stand? Well, then Revelation chapter 7 starts, and what do we see? We see the sealed ones of God. They're the ones who can stand. That's a really neat connection that you can make in that particular context in Revelation, but I'll digress here. So he talks about this abomination of desolation. He tells them to flee, to run away. And then he talks about, in verse 21, there's going to be this great tribulation. You talk about the great tribulation, and that's where you might get some people to pay attention to what you're saying, because this piques a lot of people's interest. Well, as Jesus is referring to it here, immediately this refers to the actual destruction of the temple. You need to run because the temple and because Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And again, I've pointed it out, secular history, in particular Josephus, he goes into some pretty big details about it, records just how brutal this destruction really was. Josephus, in his records, I believe he even says 1 million people perished during the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, which, for that period of time, that's a lot of people. That's still a lot of people today. Well, think about that context as well back then in the first century. So this obviously refers, in one context, to the destruction of Jerusalem, but in the forever context, it's alluding to the period that you and I are living through in this very moment. And this goes back to what we talked about before. These last days, we're living in them as we speak. When you read about this period of tribulation, we're living in it. And again, I touched on this last week. This isn't some far-off event. This is happening now. And I have here a reference to Revelation 7. It says here, one of the elders addressed me saying, "Who are these?" This is sealed ones of God, right? I think at first it's 144,000, but then that's the number that he hears, but then he looks and he sees a crowd of people that you can't number. So keep that in mind if you're studying with certain people. He says, "Who are these clothed in white robes, and from where have they come?" John says, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So these are the ones coming out of the Great Tribulation, the sealed ones of God, the ones who bear the seal of God, not the seal or the mark of the beast, which that comes later in Revelation. Did you have a comment, Brad?
One of the things is you've got to just, they had a hard time understanding this. They just never thought that Jerusalem would be, Jerusalem of all places would be destroyed. Then the temple, it'd just be unthinkable that, so they're thinking of it in the temporary sense, just, that's not the right word, but, they're thinking of that just in the temporal sense of the destruction of Jerusalem, like the destruction of the kingdom. Well, the kingdom is far greater. They just don't understand that.
Yeah. Brad, if you didn't hear him, touches on the fact that to Jesus's hearers here, his disciples, this would have been a challenging thing to hear because they thought pretty highly of the temple. And perhaps for good reason, because the temple at that time was the central institution for their religion. All things happened in the temple. Well, there's going to come a time, Jesus, you can see him touch on this in John chapter 4, when he tells the woman at the well, we're going to not worship at a location, but we worship in spirit and in truth. There's a time that is coming and is now here, Jesus told that woman. Well, this is something they didn't understand because this is the way it's always been. Well, sometimes just because it's the way it's always been, that doesn't mean that's the way it needs to be and the way that it will be. That's what is coming here, and this would have been a challenging thing, moving from a physical posture of worship to a now spiritual one. And perhaps this is why God does have the temple destroyed, to do away with that presumption that it has to be done at the temple. No, it's done in spirit and in truth, as Jesus says in John chapter 4. So there's this great tribulation that is going to happen, and as I've said, is happening to us now. But notice what happens when, I don't know why that PowerPoint did that, that was kind of weird. Notice here that this is for the sake of the elect, that it's going to be cut short, as it says in verse 22. If those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. This is interesting because we think of it, and again, thinking of this in terms of the period of time that we're living in today, the time after the cross. We're on the other side of the cross, right? This is when this period has started. This seems long to us, and some writers of the Bible even point this out, like Peter in 2 Peter 3 and verse 9. This is a verse I think a lot of us are familiar with, talking about how God is not slow to fulfill His promise, right? But to us, maybe it seems a little slow. Here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting. And it's possible 2,000 more years from now, we might still be waiting. And so on and so forth. But we don't know. We'll get to that when we get to the end of this chapter. But it seems like it's a long time. And there's a scene in Revelation that I like as well. I didn't put it on the screen, so I'll read it. From Revelation 6. It's an interesting connection again to make, where this is, again, as the 7 seals are being broken in this chapter. And starting in verse 9, it says, when he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. So these are the martyrs. They're under the altar as John is seeing it. In verse 10, it says, they cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And so here you have the slain ones of God under the altar asking the question, how long? This seems like it's going on for a long time. But keep in mind, we're talking about a God who exists outside of time, right? A day is like 1,000 years and so on and so forth. So despite this seeming long to us, it will be cut short. And again, I think that says something good about God, that He cuts it off for the sake of the elect, which is us. We're the elect ones. So then Jesus once again warns about these false Christs. He did it at the beginning and he's doing it now again. The fact that he's repeating this warning tells us that this is something that we need to be ready for. False Christs are going to come. And they may even, as he says in verse 24, be able to perform great signs and wonders. The signs and wonders give credibility. That's kind of the point of a lot of the signs and wonders that Jesus did. But some perhaps can duplicate some of these things. Jesus' warning is do not believe it. And the reason is because, as Jesus is going to say, there's one particular sign when he comes that we need to be looking for. And I'll spoil it. The sign is him. If we see him, we'll know. And what we see in this, as Jesus is unpacking this, his coming, why is it that way? That's odd. Jesus' coming will be unquestionable. There will be no doubt about it. Some may say that he's already come back. We know that that can't be the case because it's even disputed. It won't be disputed. He says here in verse 27, as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. This speaks of the fact that everyone will be able to see it. As far as the east is from the west, it will be known that Jesus has returned. And he goes on to say in verse 28 that this will be as public and as obvious as vultures that are out gathering a carcass. That's what I think that means. There's debate as to what that phrase actually means. But that's what, given the context, that's what that seems to be referring to, at least to me. This is going to be as public and as obvious as vultures gathering a carcass. They don't care who sees them. They're out there and they're getting that carcass. Garfield mentioned this verse last week, and I think it's worth pointing out again in Revelation 1 and verse 7, where John is talking about the Lord, and it says, behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen. Every eye will see him. It'll be undisputable that Jesus will have come back. And he further proves his point as we get into verses 29 through 31 by speaking now of the sign of his coming. So starting in verse 29, it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So now he points out this sign of his coming. What's the sign of his coming? It's his coming. When you see him coming in the clouds, that's how you know. You don't have to worry about all these other things. If you see Jesus coming in the clouds, you can know it's him. And this coincides with when Jesus ascends to heaven. You read that in Acts 1. As he's ascending to heaven, what are the apostles told? He will come back just as he is left. He went up in the clouds. He'll come back down in the clouds as well. And so the sign of Jesus' coming is simply seeing him coming. He himself is the sign. Kaufman, I think, put it pretty well, and this is pretty simple to explain it this way. He says, the sign of Jesus' coming is thus his actual appearance on the clouds of heaven in great glory. What a profound thought that is. You can know he's coming when you see him. That will be the sign. Yeah, then it's too late. That's when we get to the latter part of chapter 24 and into chapter 25, you see the urgency of being ready. Because when you see him, it's going to be too late. So what's going to happen when the Son of Man returns? Well, you can piece that together from different scriptures, like 1 Thessalonians 4, for example, is a good one to go to. But Jesus here says a few things. On the one hand, he says the tribes of the earth will mourn. And the reason they're going to be mourning is, as Brad just said, it's going to be too late for them to repent. They will have wasted their opportunity. So that's one thing we see. The tribes of the earth will mourn. And another thing we see is Jesus says his angels, verse 31, will be sent out with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So those of us who are elect, those of us who are in Christ, we will be gathered up by his angels. And you can make a pretty direct comparison here with the parable of the tares, right? What does he say there in chapter 13? He talks about how the angels will come as he's giving the explanation for the parable. He says, the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Just as weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. So there it's actually the weeds that will be gathered, but here we see the elect ones will also be gathered. Just as you take the wheat, you store it in the barn, you take the weeds and you throw them in fire so that they can be burned. The angels will come and they will gather the elect from the four winds. In other words, from everywhere they will be gathered. You won't be left behind. There's fiction that talks about that, and I call it fiction for a reason, because that's not how it's going to be. No one will be left behind. And then Jesus, when we get to verse 32, uses the fig tree as an example. So in verse 32, starting there, let me go back to chapter 24. Jesus says, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, or it is near, depending on how your version might read, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So now Jesus gives this example of the fig tree. And we've just seen an example of a fig tree before in chapter 21. I don't know if there's a connection you can make there or not, but it's interesting. And what Jesus says here is when the branch of a fig tree puts out its leaves, that's how you know summer's coming. When things begin to bud. And we're kind of seeing that here in this spring, even though the temperature may not feel like it. Summer's coming. The branches will put out its leaves, and that's how you know. And that's a simple observation to make, which is interesting because this is precisely the problem with the fig tree that Jesus rebuked in chapter 21. It had leaves, but it wasn't bearing fruit. Typically, when you have leaves, you should have fruit, but that particular tree did not have it. So you can tell when summer's coming, perhaps based on temperatures or based on the fig tree, as Jesus says here. And just as you can do that with the fig tree, you can look at these signs and you can know when these things will take place. These are indicators of what is coming. And what we see here is Jesus is near, or the end is near, when these things are all able to be seen. That's what he says in verse 33. I'll read it again. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Well, that raises a pretty big question. What are these things? He says when you see these things, you'll know he's near. Well, what are these things that he's talking about? Is this the destruction of the temple? Is it his return? Is it the signs that are described in this chapter, such as the false Christ coming, the false prophets, those falling away, all that list that we looked at before? Is it perhaps all of the above? I would say so, personally. So he talks about when you see these things, you will know that all these are, he says, I lost my place. When you see these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Then in verse 34, he talks about a generation that's not going to pass away until all these things have happened. So what about that generation? If these things refers to the temple, what he's saying is this is going to happen within their lifetimes. And in many cases, that is what happened. He's probably saying these things around the year 30 A.D. This is leading up to his death, the Holy Week as it's called in the religious world, the week before he is crucified. And secular history tells us that that was around 30 A.D. Well, the destruction of the temple happens in 70 A.D., so this is approximately 40 years before that happens. Certainly within the lifetime of some of these men. Some of them certainly could have lived to have seen it. But if these things are all of the signs, like we've unpacked already, then that means they would have come true shortly after this. And when you observe it, you can see that evidently they did begin to come true after. Because you read, like what John writes, we're in the last days. The Hebrew writer talks about in these last days, so on and so forth. And so what we see here as we unpack this is, you know that it's near when you see these things. Well, we see these things today, so shouldn't that mean for us that we should think of it as being near? We take for granted the fact that we can go to bed and wake up the next morning. Well, what if we don't get that opportunity? And I'm not talking about, say you pass away in your sleep or something. Jesus could return at any moment's time. And the sense of urgency will become more clear as Jesus continues to unpack all of this. But we need to take what he says at the end of this little section here and think about it. He says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What you have here is a contrast. On the one hand, you have heaven and earth. This is referring to the physical world that we live in. We think of heaven as spiritual, but as Jesus is using it here, it's more or less referring to the sky and the ground. The elements here will pass away. All of this is temporary, similar to the temple. The temple was a temporary thing, despite what they may have thought of it as. Heaven and earth will pass away, but as Jesus says, my words will not pass away. So what we're left with here, and as we get into the warning that Jesus gives about the fact that no one knows when it's coming, that'll be verse 36. We'll get to that 2 weeks from now, because we have the gospel meeting next Sunday. We need to think about this question. What are we going to value more? These things that are going to pass away? Or are we going to value what Jesus says and the warnings that he is showing us here? I hope we'll take those warnings to heart. 1 minute left. Any questions? Yes, Becky.
I just wondered how the disciples interpreted all of this, or what they got out of this, because up to this point they still believed that he was going to have an earthly kingdom and reign on the earth. I mean, even up to whenever he talked about he was going to die at the hands of men and things like that, they didn't understand any of that. It's like they really didn't understand Jesus' purpose and what it was all leading to. They thought it was more of an earthly kingdom, and I've always wondered, what did they get out of this? How did they understand this, what Jesus was talking about, him coming back? Well, where was he going? I don't know. That's just always been something I've wondered about with this chapter.
She's asking, how would the apostles have understood this? They probably would have understood it like I understand it and been very confused. A lot of confusion going on. And you even see it after Jesus is raised from the dead. In Acts 1, they ask the question, are you going to establish your kingdom? Even then, they're still thinking earthly kingdom in Acts 1, before they receive the Holy Spirit and so on and so forth. So I don't know what they could have understood, if anything, because this is obviously very difficult. And they would have perhaps had an easier time because they get the context of it. We're in a very different context, but...
Be ready.
Yeah. When we get to verse 36, that's going to be the warning. Concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Thank you.